Before we dive into the twisted, often incomprehensible world of medieval jurisprudence, let me paint you a picture that might keep you awake tonight. Imagine living in a time when sneezing too loudly could be considered an act of rebellion, where owning the wrong colour thread could sentence you to public humiliation, and where your very thoughts could be dragged before a court and judged worthy of death. Tonight, we're venturing into an era when the law wasn't just harsh. It was a living nightmare that followed you from cradle to grave, watching your every move, listening to your every word, and punishing you for crimes you never knew existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hello, and welcome to what might be the most unsettling journey through history you'll ever take. Before we begin unravelling these tales of legal horror that somehow masqueraded as justice, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your world right now, whether you're settling in for the night in Stockholm, grabbing a late coffee in Seoul, taking a lunch break in Sao Paulo, or maybe you're one of those brave souls listening to this during a midnight shift in Mumbai. I'm genuinely thrilled that you've chosen to spend this time exploring the darkest corners of human legal history with me. And here's the thing. If you find yourself both horrified and fascinated by these stories of how our ancestors twisted justice into something barely recognisable, if you discover that you can't look away from these tales of bureaucratic cruelty and legal absurdity, then please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because what we're about to explore together isn't just history. It's a reminder of how quickly civilization can turn its own rules into instruments of terror. And trust me, we've only just begun to scratch the surface of how creative humans can be when they decide to use law as a weapon. You see, when most people think about medieval times, they picture knights and castles, maybe some plague and peasants. But what they don't realise is that lurking beneath all of that was a legal system so bizarre, so cruel, and so all-encompassing that it makes modern bureaucracy look like a gentle massage. We're talking about laws that could condemn you for the way you walked, for the dreams you had, for the colour of your eyes, or for simply being in the wrong place when someone important was having a bad day. Tonight's journey will take us through legal landscapes where a child could be executed for stealing an apple, where a woman could be buried alive for talking back to her husband, where entire families could be wiped out because someone 3 villages over claimed they looked suspicious. These weren't the exceptions. These were the rules, written in stone and enforced with a brutality that would make medieval torture devices seem merciful by comparison. I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you wake up tomorrow morning and discover that the law has changed overnight. Suddenly wearing blue is illegal. Singing after sunset is punishable by branding. Looking directly at anyone wealthier than you is considered an act of treason. Laughing too loudly means you'll spend the next month in the stocks while neighbours throw rotten food at your face. Reading anything other than religious texts could cost you your tongue. And the worst part, nobody tells you about these new laws until you've already broken them. This is exactly what life was like for millions of people across medieval Europe. From the fog-shrouded moors of Scotland to the sun-baked hills of Sicily, from the dense forests of the Germanic tribes to the busy marketplaces of Flemish towns. The law wasn't something that protected you. It was something that hunted you, day and night, looking for any excuse to pounce. What makes these stories even more chilling is how normal they seem to the people who created them. Judges would sentence a baker to have his hands crushed for selling bread that was slightly underweight, then go home and kiss their children goodnight as if they'd spent the day planting flowers. Town councils would vote to have a woman's ears cut off for gossiping, then adjourn for dinner and discuss the weather. Kings would sign death warrants for peasants who dared to pick up, and perhaps most terrifying of all, these laws weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully crafted, meticulously recorded, and systematically enforced by people who genuinely believed they were creating a better world. Every horrific punishment, every impossible requirement, every trap that ordinary people couldn't avoid, all of it was written down, debated, refined, and passed down through generations like precious family heirlooms. From the merchant who could lose everything for charging a fair price during a famine, to the mother who could be declared a witch for trying to save her dying child with herbal medicine, to the farmer who could be hanged for defending his crops from wild animals that belonged to the local lord, we'll meet them all tonight. Real people, living real lives, crushed beneath the weight of laws that seemed designed not to create order, but to ensure that order could never be questioned. So settle in, wherever you are in this world, whatever time your clock is showing. Take a deep breath, because we're about to descend into a legal underworld where common sense went to die, where mercy was a foreign concept, and where the simple act of being human could be the most dangerous crime of all. The stories you're about to hear aren't fiction. They're not exaggerated for dramatic effect. If anything, they're toned down because the full truth of medieval legal brutality is almost too dark for the human mind to fully comprehend. These are the real accounts of what happened when civilization decided that fear was more important than fairness, when control mattered more than compassion, and when the law became humanity's greatest enemy. Welcome to the medieval world, where justice wore a blindfold not to remain impartial, but to avoid seeing the horrors it was creating. Let's begin this journey together, and may we both emerge with a deeper appreciation for the fragile nature of the freedoms we take for granted today. Tonight, we're stepping through the mists of time to explore what historians quietly call the Age of Legal Terror, a period spanning roughly from the 6th to the 16th centuries, when European civilization developed the most sophisticated, comprehensive, and utterly merciless system of human control ever devised. These weren't just harsh laws born from primitive thinking. These were calculated instruments of psychological warfare, designed to break the human spirit and ensure that rebellion wasn't just difficult, it was literally unthinkable. What we're about to uncover together goes far beyond the simple brutality that most people associate with medieval times. Yes, there were executions and torture, but those were just the theatrical finale of a much more insidious performance. The real horror lay in the everyday laws, the ones that didn't make it into dramatic movies or historical novels because they were too subtle, too pervasive, and too psychologically devastating to capture in simple scenes of violence. Picture, if you will, a legal system so intricate and so omnipresent that it governed not just your actions, but your thoughts, your dreams, your facial expressions, the pace of your breathing, the direction of your glance, and even the way you held your shoulders when walking past certain buildings. These laws didn't just punish criminals, they created criminals out of every living person, then offered the illusion of mercy by selectively choosing whom to destroy. We're talking about regulations that could condemn a child for picking up a pretty stone that happened to contain traces of silver, making them guilty of theft from the crown. Laws that made it illegal for a pregnant woman to crave certain foods, because those cravings might indicate she was carrying a child destined for witchcraft. Statutes that required farmers to report if their chickens laid eggs with unusual shells, because such eggs were considered omens that needed immediate investigation by church authorities. These weren't the products of ignorance or superstition, though they were certainly wrapped in those comfortable explanations. These were the creations of brilliant, calculating minds who understood exactly how to use fear, confusion, and impossible standards to maintain absolute control over human populations. The architects of these legal monstrosities were scholars, theologians, and political theorists, who spent decades perfecting systems of oppression that would make modern totalitarian regimes look clumsy and amateurish by comparison. From the frost-covered fjords of Norway to the sun-baked olive groves of southern Italy, from the windswept moors of Ireland to the dense forests of what we now call Germany, these laws spread like a plague of regulation, adapting to local customs while maintaining their core purpose, ensuring that every human being lived in constant paralyzing fear of doing something wrong. What makes these laws particularly diabolical is how they were presented. They weren't sold as instruments of oppression, they were marketed as divine protection, as necessary measures to maintain godly order, as compassionate guidelines to help people avoid sin and damnation. The Church blessed them, scholars defended them with complex theological arguments, and even many of the victims convinced themselves that their suffering was both necessary and just. The legal codes we'll explore tonight contain requirements so specific and so numerous that compliance was mathematically impossible. A single day in the life of an ordinary person might involve breaking dozens of laws without ever realizing it. The angle at which you hung your laundry could violate sumptuary regulations. The herbs you gathered for dinner could constitute theft from ecclesiastical property. The songs you hummed while working could be classified as blasphemous corruption of sacred melodies. But perhaps most insidiously, these laws were designed to turn communities against themselves. They created systems where survival depended on reporting your neighbours, where families were encouraged to denounce their own members, where children were taught that their highest duty was to inform authorities about their parents' private conversations. The law didn't just punish individuals, it poisoned the very concept of human trust and solidarity. Tonight, we'll witness how a baker in Flemish Bruges could face execution not for poisoning bread, but for baking it during the wrong phase of the moon. We'll discover how a mother in Castilian Spain could be burned alive not for harming her children, but for teaching them to count using pebbles instead of officially sanctioned counting methods. We'll explore how a craftsman in Saxon Germany could lose his hands not for stealing tools, but for creating objects that were deemed too beautiful for his social station. These stories aren't isolated incidents or examples of individual cruelty. They're windows into a systematic approach to human control that operated on principles so alien to our modern understanding of justice that they're almost impossible to comprehend. Yet comprehend them we must, because buried within these historical horrors are lessons about how quickly civilization can transform its own protective mechanisms into instruments of universal terror. The laws we'll encounter tonight were enforced not by distant tyrants, but by ordinary people, neighbours, friends, family members who genuinely believed they were serving God and protecting society by reporting, prosecuting and punishing anyone who deviated from impossible standards of perfection. The true tragedy isn't just the suffering of the victims, but the moral corruption of entire societies that convinced themselves that such suffering was not only acceptable, but virtuous. We'll journey through legal labyrinths where the punishment for theft was death, but the definition of theft included borrowing a cup without permission, picking fruit from a tree whose ownership was unclear, or even looking too long at something that belonged to someone else. We'll explore courts where the accused were required to prove their innocence using methods that guaranteed their guilt, where witnesses were tortured until they provided the testimony the authorities wanted to hear, and where mercy was considered a sign of dangerous weakness that needed to be purged from the judicial system. So prepare yourself for a descent into humanity's darkest chapter of legal history, where the very concept of justice was turned inside out and used as a weapon against the innocent. These aren't just stories about the past, they're warnings about how quickly the mechanisms meant to protect us can be perverted into tools of our own destruction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let's begin not with kings in their golden halls or bishops in their marble cathedrals, but with Alric the Reed Cutter, a man whose name appears in the tax records of a small Frisian village in the year 1247. Alric lived in a world where survival depended not on strength or intelligence, but on an almost supernatural ability to navigate an invisible maze of regulations that could transform any ordinary action into a capital offence. On a grey morning in late September, Alric woke before dawn to harvest reeds from the marshy lowlands near his village. This wasn't a casual decision. Winter was approaching, and without sufficient reeds to repair his roof, his family would freeze to death before spring. But what Alric couldn't have known, what no one had bothered to tell him, was that the Bishop of Utrecht had issued a new decree 3 weeks earlier, claiming divine authority over all growing things that bend in the wind within 50 miles of any church. The reeds Alric had harvested for 30 years, the same reeds his father and grandfather had cut before him, were now classified as ecclesiastical property. By sunrise, when Alric returned to his cottage with bundles of reeds strapped to his back, he had unwittingly committed what the church courts would classify as aggravated theft from the divine realm, a crime punishable by the removal of both hands. But Alric's story illustrates something far more sinister than simple legal overreach. The Reed Decree wasn't an isolated incident or an example of bureaucratic confusion. It was part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to ensure that every person in the region lived in a state of constant legal vulnerability. The church had systematically claimed ownership of resources that common people needed to survive, not because they wanted the reeds themselves, but because they wanted the power that came from being able to arbitrarily decide who lived and who died. When Alric was dragged before the ecclesiastical court, the proceedings followed a pattern that had been perfected across medieval Europe. First, he was accused not just of theft, but of spiritual rebellion against divine order. The court argued that by taking reeds without permission, he had demonstrated the same prideful defiance that caused Lucifer's fall from heaven. This wasn't just about reeds. This was about the fundamental structure of cosmic authority. The evidence against Alric consisted of the reeds themselves, which were presented to the court as if they were murder weapons. 3 witnesses testified that they had seen him cutting reeds, though none mentioned that such cutting had been legal for generations. The court recorder carefully noted that Alaric had been observed working with unusual vigour, which was interpreted as evidence of guilty consciousness. His efficiency in cutting reeds, a skill developed over decades of practice, was twisted into proof that he knew he was committing a crime. What makes Alaric's case particularly revealing is how the legal system handled his attempts at defence. When he argued that he had been cutting reeds from the same marsh for 30 years without incident, the court responded that ignorance of new laws was itself a crime, demonstrating willful blindness to divine will. When he pointed out that no one had informed him of the new regulations, he was told that God's true servants would have received divine revelation about the change. His failure to receive such revelation was presented as evidence of his spiritual corruption. The court offered Alaric a choice that perfectly exemplified the cruel illusions of medieval justice. He could submit to immediate amputation of both hands, or he could undergo trial by sacred ordeal to determine God's judgment on his case. The ordeal would involve carrying a red-hot iron bar for 9 paces, while the court observed whether his flesh burned. If God protected him from injury, he would be declared innocent. If he was burned, which was essentially guaranteed, his guilt would be confirmed, and he would face not just amputation, but death by burning for attempting to deceive the divine tribunal. Alaric chose the ordeal, perhaps hoping that 30 years of honest labour might earn him some measure of divine protection. The iron bar was heated until it glowed white-hot in the forge that had been built specifically for such proceedings. Church officials blessed the metal, praying that it would serve as an instrument of God's justice. Alaric's wife and 3 children were forced to watch from the courtyard, their presence required by law to ensure that the lesson of his punishment would be properly absorbed by his family. As expected, the ordeal left Alaric's hands severely burned. The court physician, who was also a church official, examined the wounds and declared them evidence of divine judgment. But even then, the legal proceedings weren't finished. Alaric was required to confess publicly not just to stealing reeds, but to harbouring rebellious thoughts against church authority. He was forced to admit that his crime stemmed from spiritual pride and to thank the court for providing him with an opportunity to purge his soul through suffering. The final sentence went beyond physical punishment. Alaric's family was required to pay a fine equivalent to 3 years of normal income, money they didn't have and couldn't possibly raise. Their cottage was marked with a painted symbol indicating that they had harboured a convicted criminal, making it nearly impossible for them to trade in local markets or receive assistance from neighbours. His children were banned from attending church services for 1 year, effectively ostracising them from community life during the crucial period when they would normally have been learning trades or seeking marriages. But perhaps most devastatingly, the court issued a decree stating that Alaric's corruption of divine resources had potentially contaminated the entire marsh. For the next 7 years, no one in the village would be permitted to cut reeds from the area where he had worked. This meant that dozens of families would be unable to maintain their homes properly, leading to a cascade of hardship that would affect the community for years to come. The brilliance of this punishment lay not in its cruelty, but in its comprehensiveness. The legal system had transformed one man's attempt to winterize his home into a community-wide catastrophe that reinforced the power of ecclesiastical authority while simultaneously demonstrating the terrible consequences of defying that authority. Every family in the village now understood that the law could reach into their most basic survival activities and transform necessity into criminality without warning. Alaric survived the ordeal, but his hands never fully healed. He spent his remaining years as a beggar, holding up his scarred stumps as a reminder to others of what happened to those who failed to navigate the legal maze successfully. His story spread throughout the region, serving its intended purpose as a deterrent to anyone who might consider questioning the ever-expanding reach of ecclesiastical law. What makes Alaric's case representative rather than exceptional is how it demonstrates the fundamental principle underlying medieval legal systems. The law wasn't designed to be fair, predictable, or even comprehensible. It was designed to be inescapable. Every person, no matter how law-abiding, lived constantly on the edge of catastrophic legal disaster, dependent entirely on the mercy and whims of authorities who viewed such mercy as a dangerous weakness that undermined their own power. Auric's tragedy wasn't an isolated incident of overzealous local enforcement. It was a single thread in a vast tapestry of legal terror that stretched across medieval Europe, connecting seemingly unrelated regulations into a comprehensive system of human control. What appeared to be random cruelty was actually the methodical implementation of what church scholars called lex omnipresens, the all-present law that would govern every aspect of human existence from birth to burial. The Reed decree that destroyed Auric's life was just one of 17 similar proclamations issued by the Bishop of Utrecht in the autumn of 1247. Within the same month, ecclesiastical authorities had claimed divine ownership of all waters that reflect the sky, making it illegal to draw from wells or streams without paying tribute to the church. They declared possession of sounds that carry prayer-like qualities, effectively criminalizing certain types of singing, humming, or even crying that might be confused with religious activities. Most devastatingly, they asserted control over movements that mirror sacred gestures, a regulation so vague that it could be applied to virtually any human action. This wasn't theological overreach, it was legal engineering. Church scribes had spent months studying the daily routines of common people, identifying every action necessary for survival, then crafting regulations that would make those actions contingent on ecclesiastical approval. The goal wasn't to collect tribute from reeds and wells. It was to create a legal framework where every human being existed in a state of perpetual debt to church authority. The enforcement mechanisms were equally sophisticated. Each diocese maintained what were euphemistically called observer networks, carefully organized systems of surveillance that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. These weren't simple informants or occasional spies. They were comprehensive monitoring systems that tracked human behavior with bureaucratic precision. Brother Matthias of Deventer, whose administrative records survived the centuries in a monastery archive, documented the scope of these operations with chilling efficiency. His ledgers show that by 1248, the Diocese of Utrecht employed over 300 spiritual wardens, whose sole responsibility was monitoring compliance with ecclesiastical regulations. These wardens were trained to recognize violations through subtle signs, the way someone walked after visiting a well, the expression on a person's face while gathering firewood, the tone of voice used when speaking to children. Each warden was assigned a specific geographic territory and given detailed instructions on what to observe. They recorded not just obvious violations but patterns of behavior that might indicate spiritual resistance. A farmer who consistently avoided looking toward the church while working his fields might be flagged for visual disobedience. A woman who sang lullabies with non-approved melodies could be reported for corrupting sacred harmonies. Children who played games that involved jumping or spinning might be cited for mimicking angelic movement without permission. The reporting system was designed to ensure that no violation, however minor, would escape documentation. Wardens submitted weekly reports using standardized forms that categorize violations by type, severity, and potential for spiritual contamination. These reports were reviewed by teams of church lawyers who specialized in identifying patterns that might indicate organized resistance to ecclesiastical authority. Brother Matthias's records reveal the staggering scope of this surveillance apparatus. In a single month, the wardens of Utrecht documented over 2,000 potential violations across a region containing roughly 15,000 inhabitants. This means that statistically every person in the diocese was violating church law multiple times per week, usually without realizing it. The legal terminology alone demonstrates the sophisticated nature of this system. Church lawyers had developed precise classifications for different types of violations. Actus praesumptuosus covered actions that showed excessive confidence or independence. Gestus imitativus applied to movements that resembled religious ceremonies. Sonus profanus encompassed any sound that might compete with officially sanctioned church music. Aspectus rebellis criminalized looking at things in ways that suggested questioning of authority. Each category carried different penalties and required different types of evidence for prosecution. Minor violations might result in public penance or small fines, but repeated offences in any category could be combined to support charges of systematic spiritual rebellion, which carried penalties up to and including death. The system was designed to ensure that anyone who attracted official attention could be prosecuted successfully, regardless of their actual behaviour. The geographic spread of these regulations reveals their systematic nature. Similar surveillance networks operated in Paris under Archbishop Guillaume d'Auvergne, in Canterbury under Archbishop Edmund of Abingdon, and in Cologne under Archbishop Conrad von Hochstaden. Each region adapted the basic framework to local conditions, but the underlying principles remained consistent: create impossible standards, monitor compliance obsessively, and use selective enforcement to maintain a climate of fear. In the Flemish territories, church authorities focused particularly on regulating commercial activities. Merchants were required to obtain spiritual licenses that certified not just their goods, but their motivations for selling them. A baker who seemed excessively proud of his bread could be charged with commercial vanity. A cloth merchant who displayed fabrics too attractively might face accusations of encouraging material lust. These weren't metaphorical concerns, they were legally actionable offences with specific penalties outlined in ecclesiastical law codes. The English dioceses developed particularly sophisticated systems for monitoring domestic life. Church wardens were trained to recognise signs of matrimonial discord that might indicate insufficient submission to divine authority. Couples who argued too frequently, or conversely, who seemed too happy together, could both face investigation. The reasoning was that proper Christian marriage should reflect the relationship between the church and its congregation, grateful submission tempered by awareness of unworthiness. Perhaps most insidiously, these systems were designed to be self-reinforcing. Community members were not just encouraged but legally required to report violations they witnessed. Failure to report a neighbour's violation was itself a serious offence called complicity in spiritual rebellion. This created communities where trust became impossible, and paranoia was a survival necessity. The legal codes made clear that ignorance provided no protection. In fact, church lawyers argued that ignorance of the law was itself evidence of spiritual inadequacy. A truly devout person, they claimed, would receive divine inspiration about new regulations. Therefore, violating unknown laws actually proved that the violator lacked sufficient faith to deserve divine guidance. The sophistication of this system becomes clear when examining its long-term effects. Within 2 generations, entire communities had internalized these monitoring mechanisms. Parents taught children to police their own behavior obsessively. Neighbors watched each other constantly, not out of malice, but out of genuine fear that failing to report violations would result in their own prosecution. The external surveillance system had successfully implanted itself into the psychological framework of medieval society, creating populations that oppressed themselves more efficiently than any external authority could manage. The surveillance systems we've explored were merely the foundation for something far more psychologically devastating. Legal frameworks so internally contradictory that compliance became mathematically impossible. Medieval lawmakers didn't just create harsh rules, they crafted paradoxes that would trap even the most careful citizen in webs of logical impossibility, ensuring that everyone was simultaneously guilty and innocent, depending on which laws the authorities chose to enforce. Consider the case of Master Godwin the Illuminator, a manuscript artist working in the city of Reims during the winter of 1284. Godwin had spent 15 years building a reputation for creating beautiful religious texts, his work adorning the libraries of monasteries across northern France. But in December of that year he found himself caught in what legal scholars of the time called jurisprudentia circularis, circular law that made compliance with one regulation automatically violate another. The contradiction began with 2 seemingly reasonable church edicts. The first, issued in November, required all religious artwork to demonstrate appropriate humility before divine majesty. This meant that images of saints, angels, and biblical figures should appear suitably modest and restrained, never displaying excessive beauty that might distract from spiritual contemplation. The second edict, issued just 3 weeks later, mandated that all religious artwork must inspire proper reverence through magnificence worthy of divine subjects. This required images to be sufficiently elaborate and beautiful to encourage proper religious devotion. Godwin spent weeks attempting to find a middle ground between these contradictory requirements. He experimented with techniques that would make his illuminations beautiful enough to inspire reverence, but modest enough to avoid accusations of excessive pride. He consulted with church scholars, studied examples of approved artwork, and even prayed for divine guidance on how to navigate these opposing demands. His solution was a masterpiece of careful compromise, illuminations that displayed technical excellence through subtle details visible only upon close examination, while maintaining overall compositions of appropriate restraint. The work satisfied both requirements perfectly, and that perfection became his downfall. When church inspectors examined Godwin's manuscript in January 1285, they found his solution itself to be evidence of a more serious crime: intellectual pride in the face of divine mystery. The court argued that by successfully navigating contradictory regulations, Godwin had demonstrated the dangerous belief that human reason could comprehend divine will. His technical skill was reinterpreted as spiritual arrogance, and his careful compliance became proof of his rebellion against the humility that should characterize all human endeavors. The charges against Godwin revealed the true purpose of these contradictory laws. He was accused not of violating either regulation, but of presumptuous resolution of sacred paradox. The court argued that contradictions in church law existed by divine design, intended to teach humans their intellectual limitations. By finding solutions to these contradictions, Godwin had shown that he believed himself capable of understanding God's intentions, a form of blasphemy that threatened the very foundations of ecclesiastical authority. This principle of sacred paradox had been deliberately embedded throughout medieval legal systems. In the Flemish territories, merchants faced regulations requiring them to charge just prices that were simultaneously not too low to suggest desperation and not too high to suggest greed. The acceptable price range was never specified, and it shifted based on factors that were never publicly disclosed. Merchants who successfully navigated these requirements were often prosecuted for commercial sorcery, the assumption being that consistent success in impossible circumstances must involve supernatural assistance. The monastery schools developed particularly sophisticated paradoxes around education itself. Students were required to demonstrate eager pursuit of knowledge while maintaining humble acceptance of ignorance. They had to show enthusiasm for learning while avoiding any signs of intellectual pride. The most successful students often found themselves accused of scholarly presumption, while those who failed to show sufficient enthusiasm faced charges of spiritual sloth. The few who found perfect balance were accused of calculated humility, the suggestion that their modesty was itself a form of pride. These contradictions weren't accidental byproducts of bureaucratic confusion. They were carefully designed by legal theorists who understood that impossible standards created perfect control mechanisms. Brother Albertus of Cologne, whose treatise De Lege Paradoxica survived in monastery archives, explicitly outlined the theory behind these systems. He argued that laws should be crafted to ensure that every soul exists in permanent recognition of its inadequacy before divine authority. Albertus's methodology was chillingly systematic. First, identify essential human activities: working, learning, worshipping, buying, selling, creating. Second, create regulations governing these activities that appear reasonable individually but become contradictory when combined. Third, ensure that the contradictions are subtle enough that people attempt compliance rather than openly rebelling. Fourth, prosecute those who succeed in navigating the contradictions as examples of dangerous pride while also prosecuting those who fail as examples of inadequate devotion. The most sophisticated of these paradoxes involved what was called spiritual simultaneity, requirements that people experience contradictory emotional states at the same time. Penitents were required to feel genuine remorse for sin, while also maintaining grateful joy for divine mercy. Mourners at funerals had to display appropriate grief for loss, while also showing celebratory faith in divine reunion. Any person who appeared to feel only one emotion could be accused of incomplete spiritual response, while those who attempted to display both simultaneously could be charged with theatrical devotion. These emotional requirements were enforced through the practice of facial testimony, the legal doctrine that facial expressions provided reliable evidence of internal spiritual states. Church wardens were trained to recognize subtle signs of prohibited emotions: the angle of eyebrows that suggested doubt, the curvature of lips that indicated excessive earthly pleasure, the timing of tears that revealed calculated rather than genuine sorrow. Master Godwin's trial exemplified how these systems functioned in practice. The court spent 3 days analysing his illuminations, not for their content but for what they revealed about his spiritual state while creating them. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological implications of his brushstrokes, the spiritual significance of his colour choices, and the theological dangers of his compositional decisions. The prosecution argued that Godwin's precise execution revealed insufficient trembling before divine mystery. They claimed that truly humble artists would produce work showing visible signs of their unworthiness, slight imperfections that demonstrated appropriate spiritual anxiety. Godwin's technical mastery was presented as evidence that he had approached his work with sinful confidence rather than proper fear. The defense attempted to argue that Godwin's skill honored God by offering the best of human ability in divine service. This argument was immediately rejected on grounds that it demonstrated the same prideful reasoning that had produced the offending artwork. The court ruled that suggesting human skill could honor God implied that God needed human assistance, a blasphemous concept that compounded the original charges. Godwin was ultimately sentenced to have his right hand branded with a symbol indicating artistic presumption, ensuring that any future artwork would be immediately identifiable as the product of a convicted spiritual criminal. More devastatingly, he was forbidden from teaching his techniques to apprentices, effectively ending his artistic lineage and serving as a warning to other craftsmen about the dangers of achieving excellence in impossible circumstances. The brilliant cruelty of Godwin's case lay not in its severity, but in its logical inevitability. The legal system had created conditions where the most dedicated, skilled, and conscientious citizens became the most likely targets for prosecution. Success itself had been criminalized, not through direct prohibition, but through the creation of standards that made success evidence of spiritual inadequacy. While Master Godwin struggled with the impossibility of satisfying contradictory artistic requirements, across the Channel in England, an entirely different form of legal entrapment was taking root, one that didn't just punish individual actions, but systematically dismantled the very possibility of social mobility, economic independence, or geographic freedom. These weren't laws about what you could do, they were laws about who you could become. The village of Little Thornwick in Yorkshire, recorded in the Domesday Surveys of 1287, provides a perfect example of how medieval authorities used legal mechanisms to create what they called divinely ordained stability, a system where attempting to improve one's circumstances became not just difficult, but literally criminal. Every resident of Little Thornwick lived under what was known as the Statute of Perpetual Station, a comprehensive legal framework that made changing one's social position an offence against both earthly and divine authority. Young Willem the baker's son discovered the full weight of this system in the spring of 1289, when he made the fateful decision to apprentice himself to Magnus the metalworker, rather than inheriting his father's ovens. Willem's crime wasn't theft, violence, or heresy, it was ambition. Under the Statute of Perpetual Station, every person was considered to be placed in their social position by divine will, and attempting to alter that position demonstrated dangerous pride and defiance of God's plan. The legal reasoning behind Willem's prosecution reveals the sophisticated theology that underpinned these social control mechanisms. Church scholars argued that God had carefully designed society as a living reflection of heavenly hierarchy, with each person assigned a specific role that contributed to the perfect functioning of the divine order. A baker's son who attempted to become a metalworker wasn't just changing jobs, he was rejecting God's personal decision about his proper place in creation. The court documents from Willem's trial, preserved in the archives of York Minster, detail the specific evidence used against him. Witnesses testified that he had been observed studying metal with excessive fascination and handling iron tools with unnatural comfort. His quick mastery of basic metalworking techniques was presented not as evidence of natural aptitude, but as proof of his spiritual corruption. The prosecution argued that his rapid learning demonstrated he was being assisted by demonic forces, since righteous individuals would struggle appropriately when attempting to exceed their divinely appointed limitations. But Willem's case was just one thread in a vast web of mobility restrictions that extended far beyond simple occupational choices. The Statute of Perpetual Station governed everything from marriage partnerships to residential locations, from clothing styles to dietary preferences. A farmer's daughter who learned to read was guilty of intellectual presumption. A merchant's son who showed interest in scholarly pursuits faced charges of academic usurpation. Most devastatingly, parents who encouraged their children's advancement beyond the family's traditional station could be prosecuted for corrupting divine intent through parental pride. The enforcement mechanisms for these social mobility laws were particularly insidious because they operated through economic rather than physical coercion. Rather than simply forbidding occupational changes, The authorities created licensing systems that made advancement legally possible but practically impossible. Anyone seeking to change professions had to obtain a spiritual fitness certificate from ecclesiastical authorities, a process that involved months of investigation, substantial fees, and examinations designed to fail. Master Thurston the Examiner, whose records survive from the Diocese of Winchester, documented his methods for ensuring that these examinations served their intended purpose. Applicants were required to demonstrate not just competence in their desired new profession, but also appropriate humility regarding their presumption in seeking elevation. This meant that showing too much skill or confidence during the examination proved spiritual unfitness, while showing too little demonstrated inadequate preparation. Another perfect catch-22 designed to ensure failure. The examination process itself was crafted to break down applicants psychologically. Thurston's notes describe techniques for identifying dangerous ambition through subtle behavioural cues. An applicant who answered questions too quickly was demonstrating pride. One who answered too slowly was showing disrespect for the examiner's time. Perfect timing in responses was taken as evidence of calculated humility, the attempt to manipulate sacred proceedings through false modesty. Even more devastating than occupational restrictions were the laws governing geographic mobility. The Statute of Sacred Soil declared that every person was spiritually bound to the land where they were born, and unauthorized movement between parishes was classified as a form of spiritual adultery, the abandonment of one's divinely appointed earthly spouse in favour of an unlawful union with foreign territory. Travel permits were required for journeys longer than 3 miles from one's place of birth, and these permits were issued sparingly and only for approved purposes. Visiting family members required documentation, proving that the family relationship was both legitimate and spiritually beneficial. Commercial travel needed certification that the proposed business served divine rather than selfish purposes. Even pilgrimages, ostensibly encouraged by church doctrine, required extensive vetting to ensure that the motivation was genuine devotion rather than disguised wanderlust. The most sophisticated aspect of these mobility restrictions was how they were presented as protective rather than punitive measures. Church authorities argued that people who ventured too far from their birthplace risked spiritual contamination from foreign influences, moral confusion from exposure to different customs, and psychological instability from separation from their divinely appointed community. Movement was reframed as a dangerous form of spiritual promiscuity that threatened both individual souls and community stability. Dame Marguerite of Calais, whose correspondence with church authorities survived in monastery archives, provides insight into how these restrictions affected even the nobility. When she attempted to relocate from her ancestral lands in northern France to her husband's estates in Normandy, a move that would seem perfectly reasonable given medieval marriage customs, she was required to undergo extensive examination to determine whether her motivation was wifely obedience or geographical restlessness. The investigation into Marguerite's proposed move lasted 8 months and involved detailed questioning about her dreams, her eating habits, her preferred times for prayer, and her emotional responses to different types of weather. Church investigators were particularly concerned about her admission that she felt excited about seeing new landscapes, which they interpreted as evidence of sinful attachment to earthly variety, rather than proper contentment with God's original placement. Perhaps most tellingly, Marguerite's case files include correspondence between examining officials discussing the broader implications of her request. They worried that permitting noble women to relocate voluntarily might encourage similar desires among peasant women, potentially destabilizing the entire system of geographic control. Her individual request was evaluated not on its own merits, but on its potential to inspire dangerous ideas about personal freedom among the general population. The economic implications of these mobility restrictions created a system of regional labour monopolies that benefited established authorities while crushing individual opportunity. Villages were required to maintain specific population levels and occupational distributions, with legal penalties for communities that allowed too many residents to leave or too many outsiders to settle. Local lords could literally auction the right to depart their territories, creating a system where freedom of movement became a luxury good available only to the wealthy. The psychological effects of these restrictions extended far beyond their immediate practical impact. Generations of people internalized the belief that desiring change was inherently sinful, that ambition represented spiritual sickness, and that contentment with limitations was the highest form of virtue. The legal system had successfully transformed natural human desires for growth and exploration into sources of guilt and self-doubt. By the late 13th century, these social control mechanisms had created populations so thoroughly conditioned to accept their circumstances that external enforcement became largely unnecessary. People policed their own ambitions, suppressed their own curiosities, and taught their children to view opportunity itself as a dangerous temptation that should be resisted rather than pursued. While the social mobility restrictions we've explored might seem like the peak of medieval legal absurdity, they pale in comparison to what developed in the 1800s Italian city-states during the late 13th century. Legal frameworks so bizarre that they appear to have emerged from fever dreams rather than scholarly deliberation. Yet these laws were crafted by some of the most educated legal minds of their time, implemented with bureaucratic precision, and enforced with deadly seriousness that cost hundreds of lives. The city of Volterra in 1292 became the testing ground for what its legal architects called lex metaphysica, metaphysical law that attempted to regulate not just human actions, but the philosophical and spiritual implications of those actions. The mastermind behind this system was Dr. Benedictus Logicus, a scholar who had studied both canon law and Aristotelian philosophy, and who became convinced that true justice required legal intervention in the realm of abstract thought itself. Dr. Benedictus's most infamous creation was the Tribunal of Impossible Crimes, a court specifically designed to prosecute actions that were physically impossible but philosophically significant. The first case brought before this tribunal involved Antonio the Glassblower, who was accused of temporal theft after he was observed working with such focus that he appeared to lose track of time while crafting a delicate vase. The prosecution argued that by becoming so absorbed in his work that he forgot the passage of hours, Antonio had effectively stolen time from God, who was the sole legitimate owner of all temporal progression. Expert witnesses testified that Antonio's intense concentration had created a bubble of personal time that operated independently of divine chronology, constituting both theft and the heretical suggestion that human consciousness could exist separately from divine oversight. The evidence against Antonio was presented with the same seriousness accorded to murder trials. Court scribes had documented the exact duration of his apparent time loss, 3 hours and 17 minutes during which he showed no awareness of church bells, changing shadows, or other temporal markers. Witnesses testified about his facial expression during this period, describing an otherworldly concentration that suggested he had somehow extracted his consciousness from the normal flow of divine time. Dr. Benedictus himself served as chief prosecutor, arguing that Antonio's crime represented a fundamental threat to the cosmic order. If individuals could create personal time bubbles through intense focus, he claimed, the entire structure of divine temporal authority would collapse. People might begin to believe they could control their own relationship with time, leading to chaos in everything from work schedules to prayer routines. The defense attempted to argue that intense concentration was a natural human capacity that enhanced rather than threatened divine order. This argument was immediately dismissed on grounds that it demonstrated the same philosophical confusion that had led to the original crime. The court ruled that suggesting human mental states could enhance divine creation implied that God's original design was somehow incomplete, a blasphemous concept that deepened rather than mitigated Antonio's guilt. Antonio was ultimately sentenced to wear a water clock around his neck for the remainder of his life, the constant dripping serving as penance for his temporal crimes and ensuring that he could never again lose awareness of time's passage. More bizarrely, he was required to report to church authorities every hour on the hour during daylight, reciting a prescribed prayer, asking forgiveness for his chronological presumption. But Antonio's case was merely the beginning of the tribunal's exploration into impossible crimes. The court soon expanded its jurisdiction to include gravitational disobedience, the crime of achieving unusual lightness or grace in movement that suggested defiance of natural law. Lucia the dancer was prosecuted after witnesses testified that during a harvest celebration she had appeared to float during certain dance movements, creating the impression that she had somehow reduced her natural weight through supernatural means. The prosecution's case against Lucia reveals the sophisticated absurdity that characterized these proceedings. Natural philosophers were called as expert witnesses to explain the divine principles governing human weight and movement. They testified that God had carefully calibrated each person's physical density to reflect their spiritual station, and that appearing lighter than appropriate for one's social class constituted both theft of divine prerogative and fraudulent misrepresentation of spiritual status. The court spent weeks analysing witness accounts of Lucia's dancing, attempting to determine whether her apparent lightness resulted from exceptional skill, supernatural assistance, or deliberate deception. Artists were commissioned to create illustrations showing the proper degree of groundedness that should characterise peasant movement, and these were compared with detailed descriptions of Lucia's allegedly impossible grace. The investigation expanded to include Lucia's diet, sleeping patterns, and prayer habits, as prosecutors searched for evidence of activities that might have artificially altered her natural weight. They questioned her about her dreams, theorizing that excessive spiritual experiences during sleep might have created a dangerous detachment from earthly reality that manifested as physical lightness during waking hours. Perhaps most absurdly, the court commissioned a series of experimental dances performed by approved dancers of similar social station, carefully measuring their degree of groundedness to establish baseline expectations for peasant movement. These experiments, conducted with the solemnity of scientific research, were used to demonstrate that Lucia's dancing had indeed exceeded the physical possibilities available to someone of her station and spiritual development. The tribunal's jurisdiction expanded further to include what Dr. Benedictus termed mathematical heresy, the crime of discovering numerical relationships that had not been previously approved by church authorities. Master Paolo the architect faced prosecution after he developed a new method for calculating roof angles that produced structures of unusual stability and beauty. The prosecution argued that Paolo's mathematical innovation represented an attempt to discover divine truths through human reason rather than revelation, constituting intellectual pride of the most dangerous sort. They claimed that his calculations had uncovered numerical relationships that properly belonged to God's exclusive knowledge, and that his use of these relationships in earthly construction violated the divine monopoly on mathematical truth. Expert witnesses testified about the theological implications of Paolo's roof calculations, arguing that his method revealed hidden harmonies in numerical relationships that should remain mysterious to human understanding. The court commissioned a panel of approved mathematicians to verify that Paolo's calculations were indeed novel and therefore spiritually dangerous. The trial proceedings included lengthy debates about whether human reason could legitimately discover mathematical truths, or whether all genuine mathematical knowledge must come through divine revelation. Paolo's defense that his calculations simply revealed relationships that already existed in God's creation was rejected on grounds that it assumed humans had the right to explore divine creation without explicit permission. The most elaborate case handled by the tribunal involved Elena the seamstress, who was accused of aesthetic presumption after creating embroidery patterns that were deemed too beautiful for human origin. The prosecution argued that Elena's needlework displayed a level of artistic perfection that exceeded human capabilities, suggesting either supernatural assistance or fraudulent claims about her own creative abilities. The court commissioned a panel of aesthetic philosophers to analyse Elena's embroidery, comparing it with approved examples of human artistic achievement to determine whether her work fell within acceptable parameters of human capability. They measured the precision of her stitches, analysed the mathematical relationships in her patterns, and even examined the thread tensions to determine whether her techniques could be accomplished through purely human skill. Eleanor was required to demonstrate her embroidery techniques under judicial supervision, working while court observers documented every movement of her hands and recorded the time required for each stitch. When she successfully replicated her supposedly impossible techniques, the court ruled that her ability to perform under pressure proved she was either receiving supernatural assistance or had developed her skills through some form of forbidden knowledge. The sentences imposed by the Tribunal of Impossible Crimes were as elaborate as the crimes themselves. Eleanor was required to unpick all of her existing embroidery work while reciting prayers asking forgiveness for her aesthetic presumption. Paolo was forbidden from using his mathematical discoveries and required to calculate roof angles using only approved methods, even when these produced inferior results. The court argued that accepting inferior results demonstrated proper humility before divine mathematical authority. Dr. Benedictus documented these proceedings with obvious pride, believing he had created a legal framework capable of addressing the philosophical implications of human excellence. His treatise De Criminibus Impossibilibus argued that conventional law was inadequate because it addressed only actions rather than the metaphysical presumptions underlying those actions. He claimed that true justice required legal intervention in the realm of human capability itself, ensuring that excellence never exceeded divinely appropriate boundaries. While Dr. Benedictus's Tribunal of Impossible Crimes represented the absolute peak of legal absurdity, its very extremism inadvertently exposed a far more insidious problem that plagued medieval legal systems across Europe: the complete erosion of the boundary between intention and outcome, between accident and malice, between protection and persecution. What emerged was a legal landscape where the very concepts of guilt and innocence became meaningless, replaced by a system where moral categories shifted like quicksand beneath the feet of anyone unfortunate enough to encounter them. The monastery of St. Eligius in the Bavarian Highlands provides a perfect example of how protective laws mutated into instruments of oppression through the deliberate blurring of moral boundaries. The monastery had originally established what seemed like a reasonable regulation, the sanctuary of sacred silence, which protected monks during their periods of contemplative prayer by making it illegal to disturb them with unnecessary noise or interruptions. Brother Anselm the Copyist discovered the hidden trap within this protective law in the autumn of 1295, when his attempt to save a fellow monk's life became evidence of his own spiritual corruption. While working in the scriptorium during the designated hours of sacred silence, Anselm witnessed Brother Thomas collapse from what appeared to be a seizure. Without hesitation, Anselm cried out for help, his shouts bringing other monks running to assist the stricken man. Brother Thomas recovered fully, thanks entirely to Anselm's quick thinking and willingness to break the silence regulations. But rather than being praised for his life-saving action, Anselm found himself brought before the monastery's internal tribunal on charges of violating sacred silence through presumptuous intervention in divine will. The prosecution's case reveals the twisted logic that had infected even seemingly protective laws. They argued that Brother Thomas's seizure was clearly a divine test of the community's faith in God's plan. By crying out for help instead of trusting in divine providence, Anselm had demonstrated dangerous pride in human medical intervention over divine healing. His good intentions were irrelevant. In fact, they made his crime worse, since they revealed his fundamental lack of faith in God's ability to heal without human assistance. The court spent weeks analysing the theological implications of Anselm's split-second decision to call for help. Expert witnesses testified about the proper response to medical emergencies during sacred silence, explaining that truly faithful monks would have either remained silent and trusted in divine intervention, or would have offered silent prayers for their brother's healing. Anselm's instinctive cry for help was characterised as evidence of medical materialism, the heretical belief that physical problems required physical solutions. Even more perversely, the court argued that if Anselm had truly been motivated by love for his fellow monk, he would have been willing to let Brother Thomas die rather than risk corrupting his own soul through violation of sacred silence. They claimed that Anselm's decision to prioritise earthly life over spiritual obedience revealed a fundamental confusion about the relative value of physical and spiritual existence. The defence attempted to argue that saving life took precedence over regulatory compliance, citing both scriptural authority and basic human decency. This argument was immediately rejected on grounds that it demonstrated the same presumptuous reasoning that had led to the original violation. The court ruled that suggesting human judgment could override established monastic law implied that the monastery's rules were imperfect, constituting an attack on the divine inspiration that guided their creation. Brother Anselm was ultimately sentenced to 7 years of contemplative penance. Complete silence except during designated confession periods, combined with additional duties that would prevent him from being present during future medical emergencies. The sentence was explicitly designed to ensure that he would never again face the temptation to prioritize human need over regulatory compliance. This pattern of protective laws becoming persecution mechanisms was replicated across medieval Europe with stunning consistency. In the German principalities, laws designed to protect women from unwanted advances were systematically perverted to prosecute women for encouraging male attention through excessive visibility. The original intent, protecting female virtue, remained nominally intact, but enforcement focused entirely on restricting women's behaviour rather than controlling male conduct. Gretchen the miller's daughter learned this harsh reality when she reported being accosted by a local nobleman's son while drawing water from the village well. Instead of investigating her complaint, the court charged her with immodest water gathering, on the theory that a properly modest woman would have sensed the spiritual danger posed by the nobleman's presence and avoided the well entirely. The prosecution argued that Gretchen's failure to anticipate and avoid unwanted male attention proved she harboured secret desires for such attention. They claimed that truly virtuous women possessed a spiritual sensitivity that warned them away from situations where their virtue might be threatened. Her presence at the well during a time when the nobleman was in the area was presented as evidence of her complicity in creating the very situation she claimed to be a victim of. The court's reasoning created a perfect catch-22 that rendered the protective law meaningless. Women who reported unwanted advances were automatically suspect, because virtuous women wouldn't have been in situations where such advances could occur. Women who didn't report advances were also suspect because their silence suggested they had welcomed the attention. The law that had supposedly been created to protect women had been transformed into a mechanism for ensuring that any woman could be prosecuted regardless of her actual behaviour. Even more sinisterly, the court ruled that Gretchen's complaint against the nobleman's son was itself evidence of spiritual pride, since it suggested she believed her virtue was more important than social harmony. They argued that a properly humble woman would have accepted unwanted advances as a test of her spiritual strength, using the experience as an opportunity for prayer and penance, rather than seeking earthly justice. The most devastating examples of boundary erosion occurred in the realm of charitable laws, where regulations designed to ensure proper distribution of aid to the poor were twisted into mechanisms for criminalizing both poverty and generosity. The city of Augsburg established what appeared to be a progressive system of regulated charity that required wealthy citizens to contribute specific amounts to poor relief, while ensuring that aid went only to the deserving poor. Master Heinrich the cloth merchant discovered the trap hidden within these charitable obligations when he was prosecuted for excessive generosity toward unworthy recipients. Heinrich had been distributing food and clothing to beggars without first verifying their eligibility through the official church review process. His crime wasn't being uncharitable, it was being too charitable in the wrong way. The prosecution argued that Heinrich's unauthorized generosity undermined the careful spiritual screening that was supposed to accompany all charitable giving. They claimed that by feeding people who might not be spiritually worthy of assistance, he was actually enabling sin and corruption rather than performing genuine charity. His good intentions were presented as evidence of his spiritual confusion about the true nature of Christian giving. The court's theological experts testified that genuine charity required careful discrimination between worthy and unworthy recipients. They argued that indiscriminate giving actually harmed both giver and receiver by removing the spiritual benefits that came from proper evaluation of need and merit. Heinrich's failure to investigate his recipients thoroughly was characterized as spiritual laziness that corrupted the sacred act of charitable giving. Even more perversely, several of the people Heinrich had fed were brought before the court and required to testify about whether they had truly deserved his assistance. Those who claimed they had been worthy were charged with pride for presuming to judge their own spiritual state. Those who admitted unworthiness were used as evidence that Heinrich had indeed corrupted the charitable process by assisting people who should have been left to suffer as penance for their spiritual inadequacies. Heinrich was sentenced to continue his charitable giving, but under strict supervision that required him to submit detailed reports about each recipient's spiritual worthiness. The sentence transformed his genuine desire to help others into a bureaucratic nightmare that consumed more time investigating potential recipients than actually providing assistance. The systematic erosion of moral boundaries reached its logical conclusion in the concept of retrospective sin, the doctrine that actions could become sinful based on their unintended consequences, regardless of the actor's intentions or knowledge at the time. Under this principle, a farmer who planted crops that later failed could be charged with agricultural presumption for assuming his efforts would be blessed. A mother whose child died despite her careful nursing could face prosecution for maternal pride in believing human care could override divine will. These legal perversions weren't accidental byproducts of overzealous enforcement. They were the predictable result of legal systems designed to ensure that protection could always be redefined as persecution, that good intentions could always be reinterpreted as evidence of guilt, and that moral clarity could always be dissolved into profitable confusion. The systematic corruption of protective laws we've explored wasn't the result of good intentions gone wrong. It was the predictable outcome of legal systems deliberately designed to serve as weapons in the hands of those who wielded power. To understand the true horror of medieval law, we must shift our perspective from the victims to the architects, from the sufferers to the manipulators who crafted these elaborate mechanisms of control with cold calculation and brilliant strategic thinking. The court of Count Roderick the Acquisitive in the Duchy of Lorraine provides perhaps the most chilling example of how medieval nobles used legal engineering to systematically destroy their rivals while maintaining a veneer of legitimate justice. Count Roderick's innovation wasn't the brutality of his methods, it was their bureaucratic sophistication and their appearance of complete legal propriety. In the spring of 1298, Count Roderick faced a problem that was common among medieval nobility. His primary rival, Baron Gottfried of Steinheim, controlled territories that Roderick coveted, but Baron Gottfried had committed no crimes that would justify direct military action. Traditional warfare would be expensive, politically risky, and might fail to deliver the complete victory that Roderick desired. Instead, the Count commissioned a team of legal scholars to craft what they privately called jurisprudentia destructiva, destructive jurisprudence designed to eliminate enemies through apparently legitimate legal proceedings. The strategy they developed was a masterpiece of legal warfare that unfolded over 3 years and ultimately resulted in the complete destruction of Baron Gottfried's family, the confiscation of all their properties, and the legal erasure of their bloodline from historical records. Most remarkably, every step of this destruction was accomplished through laws that appeared reasonable, even progressive, when viewed individually. The campaign began with Count Roderick's legal team establishing a new court called the Tribunal of Territorial Harmony, ostensibly created to resolve disputes between neighbouring lordships through peaceful arbitration rather than warfare. The tribunal was staffed with judges who appeared impartial, scholars from distant monasteries who had no obvious connection to either Count Roderick or Baron Gottfried. In reality, these judges had been carefully selected and thoroughly briefed on their role in the coming legal destruction. The first case brought before the tribunal involved a minor boundary dispute over a small forest that bordered both nobles' territories. The case seemed trivial, a disagreement over whether a particular stream constituted the actual boundary line described in centuries-old land grants. Baron Gottfried participated in good faith, presenting maps, witness testimony, and historical documents to support his claim to the disputed territory. The tribunal's decision appeared to favour Baron Gottfried, awarding him the contested forest. But embedded within this seemingly favourable ruling was a legal time bomb. The judges declared that Baron Gottfried's victory proved his ancestors had been unjustly enriched by previous boundary disputes, and therefore he owed compensation to Count Roderick's family for historical territorial injuries dating back 6 generations. The compensation claim was carefully calculated to be impossible to pay in full without selling substantial portions of Baron Gottfried's core territories. When he attempted to negotiate a payment schedule, the tribunal ruled that his inability to provide immediate compensation demonstrated contempt for territorial justice and insufficient respect for the sacred nature of property rights. The case that had seemed to vindicate his territorial claims had been transformed into evidence of his family's historical criminality. But Count Roderick's legal engineers weren't finished. While Baron Gottfried struggled to meet the compensation demands, the tribunal initiated a comprehensive historical justice review of all territorial holdings in the region. This review, presented as a progressive attempt to correct centuries of land grabbing and feudal abuse, systematically examined the historical legitimacy of every noble family's territorial claims. The methodology of this review was designed to ensure Baron Gottfried's destruction, while protecting Count Roderick's interests. The tribunal established a principle called ancestral accountability, which held current nobles responsible for any illegitimate territorial acquisitions made by their ancestors. However, the definition of illegitimate was crafted with surgical precision. Acquisitions made through warfare were considered legitimate if they had been blessed by divine providence, while acquisitions made through legal proceedings were considered legitimate only if they had been confirmed by subsequent peaceful occupation. These definitions were specifically designed to protect Count Roderick's family history while criminalising Baron Gottfried's. Count Roderick's ancestors had acquired most of their territory through conquest, which could easily be characterized as divinely blessed. Baron Gottfried's ancestors had primarily expanded their holdings through marriage alliances and legal negotiations, methods that could be reinterpreted as illegitimate manipulation of legal systems. The Historical Justice Review took 18 months to complete and involved the examination of over 2 centuries of territorial records. The team of scholars assigned to this task worked with remarkable efficiency, discovering that Baron Gottfried's family had committed dozens of historical territorial crimes that required immediate rectification. Each discovery was presented as a surprising revelation that justified further investigation and additional penalties. Perhaps most insidiously, the review process itself was designed to bankrupt Baron Gottfried through legal fees and administrative costs. He was required to provide extensive documentation for every territorial claim, to pay for expert witnesses to authenticate historical documents, and to cover the costs of the tribunal's own research efforts. The process of defending his legitimacy consumed virtually all of his liquid assets and forced him to mortgage his remaining territories to Italian banking houses. When Baron Gottfried finally ran out of money to continue his legal defense, the tribunal ruled that his withdrawal from the proceedings constituted an admission of guilt regarding all remaining charges. They declared his entire territorial holding to be the product of centuries of systematic territorial fraud and ordered its immediate confiscation for redistribution to historically injured parties, a category that included only Count Roderick and his allies. The final phase of Baron Gottfried's destruction involved what the tribunal called genealogical purification. They ruled that his family's territorial crimes had been so extensive and so persistent across generations that they demonstrated inherent moral corruption in the bloodline itself. Baron Gottfried's children were declared spiritually contaminated by ancestral criminality and banned from holding any territorial rights in the region. His family name was ordered struck from all official records, and his coat of arms was ceremonially destroyed in a public ritual that symbolized the elimination of his lineage from the ranks of legitimate nobility. Count Roderick emerged from this legal campaign not only with all of Baron Gottfried's former territories, but with a reputation as a champion of historical justice and legal reform. The Tribunal of Territorial Harmony was praised by church authorities for its innovative approach to resolving feudal disputes without bloodshed. Legal scholars wrote treatises celebrating the Historical Justice Review as a model for correcting centuries of territorial abuse. The true genius of Count Roderick's strategy lay not in its cruelty, but in its complete legal legitimacy. Every step of Baron Gottfried's destruction had been accomplished through properly constituted courts, following established legal procedures, and producing carefully documented decisions that appeared to be based on historical evidence and legal precedent. Future scholars examining the records would find no obvious signs of corruption or manipulation, just the methodical application of progressive legal principles that happened to result in the complete destruction of one noble family and the enrichment of another. This legal campaign became a template that was quietly adopted by ambitious nobles across medieval Europe. The specific methods varied based on local legal traditions and political circumstances, but the underlying principle remained constant. Use the appearance of legal justice to accomplish what could never be achieved through honest means. Create legal frameworks that appear fair and progressive while being designed to destroy specific targets. Present systematic persecution as historical justice and bureaucratic procedure as moral necessity. The most chilling aspect of these legal warfare campaigns was how they corrupted not just their immediate victims, but the entire concept of justice itself. Courts that had once served to resolve genuine disputes became elaborate theatres, where predetermined outcomes were performed with the solemnity of legitimate judicial proceedings. Legal scholars who had once sought truth became highly paid engineers of destruction, who crafted sophisticated justifications for whatever outcomes their patrons desired. By the early 14th century, this weaponization of legal systems had become so widespread that genuine justice had become almost impossible to distinguish from sophisticated persecution. The same legal procedures that might legitimately resolve a boundary dispute could be used to systematically destroy an innocent family. The same historical research methods that might uncover actual territorial fraud could be employed to fabricate centuries of imaginary crimes. The law had become a perfectly flexible instrument that could be shaped to serve any purpose while maintaining the appearance of objective fairness. While Count Roderick's legal warfare demonstrates how authorities weaponized justice against their rivals, an even more systematic and devastating form of legal persecution was developing across medieval Europe, one that targeted an entire group of people, not for what they had done, but for what they represented. The legal destruction of the Valdensian communities in the Alpine regions during the late 13th and early 14th centuries reveals how medieval law could be used to eliminate entire populations through a process so methodical and comprehensive that it makes modern ethnic cleansing look primitive by comparison. The Valdensians were a religious movement that had emerged in the late 12th century, advocating for evangelical poverty, vernacular Bible reading, and lay preaching. While their theological differences with mainstream Catholicism were relatively minor, they represented something far more dangerous to medieval authorities: the idea that ordinary people could interpret divine will without institutional mediation. This threat required not just suppression, but total legal annihilation that would make their very existence impossible. The campaign against the Valdensians began not with violence, but with a series of legal innovations that created what papal lawyers called heretical categories, legal classifications that could transform any aspect of Valdensian life into evidence of criminality. The first of these was the doctrine of inherited heresy, which declared that heretical beliefs could be transmitted through bloodlines like genetic diseases, making the children and grandchildren of accused heretics automatically suspect regardless of their actual beliefs or practices. Sister Margherita of Valle Pellice learned the devastating implications of this doctrine in 1307, when she was arrested not for any heretical activity, but for being the daughter of a man who had died 20 years earlier under suspicion of Valdensian sympathies. Her father had never been formally tried or convicted of heresy, but church investigators had found books in his possession that contained vernacular religious texts, evidence that was retroactively classified as proof of heretical tendencies. The case against Margherita reveals the sophisticated legal framework that had been developed to prosecute inherited heresy. Church lawyers argued that heretical beliefs operated like spiritual infections that could lie dormant for generations before manifesting in dangerous behaviours. They claimed that Margherita's ability to read, an unusual skill for a peasant woman, proved she had inherited her father's dangerous attraction to unsanctioned knowledge. The prosecution presented Margherita's literacy as evidence of a heretical conspiracy that spanned decades. They argued that her father must have secretly taught her to read specifically so she could access forbidden religious texts, and that her apparent innocence was actually proof of sophisticated indoctrination in heretical concealment techniques. Her denials of any heretical beliefs were interpreted as evidence of her training in deception. Even more insidiously, the court ruled that Margherita's very existence as an educated peasant woman disrupted the divine social order and therefore constituted ongoing heretical activity regardless of her personal beliefs. They declared that her literacy created spiritual contamination in her community by inspiring other women to seek education beyond their station, spreading heretical ideas about gender roles and social hierarchy. Margherita was ultimately sentenced to preventive penance, a form of punishment designed to prevent her from committing future heretical acts that she might be genetically predisposed to perform. She was required to wear distinctive clothing marking her as the child of a suspected heretic, banned from learning or teaching any written material, and forbidden from speaking to other women without supervision. The sentence was explicitly designed to ensure that her inherited heretical tendencies could never manifest in actionable crimes. But individual prosecutions like Margherita's were just the beginning of a comprehensive legal assault on Valdensian communities. Church authorities developed what they called environmental heresy theory, the doctrine that heretical ideas could contaminate geographic locations, making entire regions spiritually dangerous and requiring systematic purification. The village of Roccapiata in the Piedmont region became the testing ground for this theory, when papal investigators declared it a heretical environment in 1309. The designation wasn't based on evidence that the villagers practiced Valdensian beliefs, but on the fact that known Valdensians had lived in the area generations earlier. Church lawyers argued that heretical activities had left spiritual residue in the landscape itself, creating atmospheric conditions that encouraged heretical thinking in anyone who lived there. The legal consequences of this environmental designation were catastrophic for Rocca Piata's residents. All property in the village was declared spiritually contaminated and subject to confiscation for purification purposes. Residents were required to undergo extensive questioning about their beliefs, their dreams, their dietary habits, and their emotional responses to church services, as investigators searched for signs of environmental heretical contamination. The questioning process was designed to be impossible to navigate successfully. Villagers who showed too much religious enthusiasm were suspected of covering heretical beliefs with false piety. Those who showed too little enthusiasm were accused of heretical indifference. Perfect balance in religious expression was interpreted as evidence of sophisticated training in heretical concealment techniques. Perhaps most devastatingly, the environmental heresy designation made it illegal for anyone to leave Rocca Piata without special permits, on the theory that heretically contaminated individuals might spread spiritual pollution to other communities. At the same time, it became illegal for anyone to enter the village without purification procedures, effectively cutting off trade and communication with the outside world. The systematic destruction of Valdensian communities reached its peak with the development of preventive heresy laws, regulations that made it illegal to engage in activities that might lead to heretical thinking, even if no actual heretical beliefs were involved. These laws created a comprehensive framework for criminalizing the everyday practices that characterize Valdensian communities. Reading vernacular religious texts became illegal regardless of their content, on the theory that unsupervised religious reading encouraged dangerous independence of thought. Gathering in groups larger than 3 for any purpose other than church-sanctioned activities was banned as potential heretical assembly. Even charitable activities were restricted, since Valdensians were known for their commitment to helping the poor, making charity itself suspect as a possible sign of heretical sympathies. Master Giovanni the scribe discovered the reach of these preventive laws when he was prosecuted for heretical preparation, after church investigators found ink and parchment in his workshop. Giovanni had been commissioned to copy a perfectly orthodox prayer book for a local monastery, but the court ruled that his possession of writing materials created the possibility that he might someday produce heretical texts. The prosecution argued that Giovanni's scribal skills represented a heretical capability that posed an ongoing threat to spiritual security regardless of how he actually used those skills. They claimed that allowing anyone with suspected heretical connections to possess writing materials was equivalent to allowing a suspected arsonist to stockpile flammable materials. The court commissioned experts to analyze Giovanni's handwriting, searching for evidence of heretical letter forms that might indicate exposure to Valdensian scribal traditions. They examined his ink recipes for signs of heretical formulations that might be used to create texts that appeared orthodox but contained hidden heretical messages. They even studied his posture while writing, claiming that heretical scribes held their pens differently than orthodox copyists. Giovanni was ultimately forced to destroy all his writing materials and take an oath never to write anything other than his own name for the remainder of his life. The sentence was designed to ensure that his heretical capability could never be actualized, regardless of his personal beliefs or intentions. The most comprehensive application of these preventive laws occurred in the systematic regulation of Valdensian family structures. Church authorities had observed that Valdensian communities were characterized by unusually strong family bonds and extensive kinship networks that provided mutual support and protection. These family structures were reinterpreted as heretical organization systems that needed to be dismantled for spiritual security purposes. New laws made it illegal for suspected heretical families to live within 10 miles of each other, effectively scattering kinship networks across vast geographic areas. Marriage between families with any history of heretical suspicion was banned, preventing the formation of new family alliances. Children from suspected heretical families were required to be educated in church institutions far from their home communities, ensuring that heretical family traditions could not be transmitted to new generations. The legal framework for destroying Valdensian communities was so comprehensive and so effective that within 2 generations, a religious movement that had flourished for over a century had been almost completely eliminated from the Alpine regions. Most remarkably, this destruction was accomplished almost entirely through legal rather than military means, creating a template for systematic persecution that would be refined and reused throughout medieval Europe. The Valdensian persecution reveals the ultimate evolution of medieval legal systems, the development of laws that could eliminate entire populations not by killing them, but by making their continued existence legally impossible. Every aspect of Valdensian life, their beliefs, their practices, their family structures, their economic activities, even their geographic locations, had been systematically criminalized through laws that appeared reasonable when viewed individually, but created an inescapable web of persecution when applied comprehensively. While the legal destruction of the Valdensians demonstrates how medieval authorities could eliminate entire populations, an equally devastating but more subtle form of control was simultaneously developing across Europe: the systematic transformation of basic economic activities into criminal enterprises. This wasn't simple taxation or regulation. It was the methodical criminalization of survival itself, creating legal frameworks where the very act of trying to earn a living became evidence of moral corruption and spiritual rebellion. The Hanseatic trading cities of northern Europe became laboratories for what their legal architects called mercantile virtue control, comprehensive systems that regulated not just what goods could be traded, but the motivations, methods, and even emotional states of those who traded them. The city of Stralsund, with its strategic position on the Baltic coast, pioneered techniques that would spread throughout the medieval commercial world and make ordinary commerce virtually impossible for anyone without political connections. Master Eric the amber trader learned the devastating scope of these new commercial laws in the winter of 1311, when his attempt to sell a collection of amber stones led to charges that would destroy not only his business, but his understanding of reality itself. Eric had been trading amber for over 20 years, following practices that had been perfectly legal throughout his career. But the Stralsund Commercial Virtue Tribunal had recently established new standards that transformed traditional trading practices into evidence of spiritual corruption. The charges against Eric began with excessive material attachment, the crime of caring too much about the quality of goods being sold. The tribunal argued that Eric's reputation for carefully selecting only the finest amber stones demonstrated dangerous pride in earthly possessions and insufficient focus on spiritual matters. They claimed that a properly humble merchant would accept whatever goods God provided without exercising personal judgment about their quality. Expert witnesses testified about the theological implications of Eric's selective trading practices. Church scholars argued that by choosing only the best amber stones, Eric was implying that God's creation included imperfect elements that required human improvement. This constituted blasphemy against divine perfection and demonstrated the spiritual pride that had caused Satan's fall from heaven. The prosecution presented Eric's successful trading record as further evidence of his guilt. They argued that consistent profits over 2 decades proved he was receiving supernatural assistance, since truly humble merchants would occasionally fail as a reminder of their dependence on divine grace. His business success was reinterpreted as evidence of a demonic pact that exchanged his soul for earthly prosperity. Even more bizarrely, the tribunal ruled that Eric's knowledge of amber quality demonstrated mineral sorcery, the unauthorized understanding of natural substances that properly belonged to divine mystery. They claimed that his ability to distinguish high-quality amber from inferior stones revealed forbidden knowledge that could only have been obtained through heretical study of natural philosophy. The investigation into Eric's mineral sorcery consumed months and involved detailed analysis of his trading methods. Church investigators examined every amber stone in his possession, searching for evidence of supernatural enhancement or demonic marking. They questioned him about his dreams, his prayer habits, and his emotional responses to different types of amber, looking for signs that his knowledge came from forbidden sources. Perhaps most devastatingly, the tribunal established a new legal principle called commercial predestination, which held that God had predetermined the proper level of prosperity for each individual based on their spiritual worth. Eric's financial success was presented as evidence that he had somehow circumvented divine will, either through demonic assistance or through the prideful rejection of his divinely appointed level of poverty. Eric was ultimately sentenced to commercial penance, which required him to continue trading but under conditions designed to ensure consistent failure. He was forbidden from examining goods before purchase, banned from negotiating prices, and required to accept the first offer made for anything he attempted to sell. The sentence was explicitly designed to restore the proper relationship between his spiritual unworthiness and his material circumstances. But Eric's case was merely one example of a comprehensive transformation of commercial law that was occurring throughout Northern Europe. The city of Lübeck developed even more sophisticated controls through their emotional commerce regulations, which attempted to regulate the feelings that merchants experienced during business transactions. Under these regulations, merchants were required to maintain appropriate spiritual anxiety during all commercial activities, demonstrating proper awareness of the spiritual dangers inherent in material exchange. Showing too much confidence during negotiations was evidence of spiritual pride, while showing too little was proof of insufficient respect for the sacred nature of trade. Perfect emotional balance was interpreted as evidence of calculated manipulation of spiritual requirements. Master Klaus the wool merchant discovered the impossibility of these emotional requirements when he was prosecuted for commercial joy excess, after witnesses testified that he had appeared genuinely happy after concluding a profitable sale. The tribunal ruled that excessive happiness about material gain demonstrated dangerous attachment to earthly success and insufficient focus on spiritual matters. The prosecution's case against Klaus reveals the sophisticated psychological surveillance that had been integrated into commercial law. Professional emotion observers had been trained to recognize subtle signs of inappropriate feelings during business transactions. They monitored facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, and even breathing patterns, searching for evidence of emotional states that violated commercial virtue requirements. Klaus was required to undergo extensive questioning about his internal experiences during the profitable sale that had triggered his prosecution. Church psychologists attempted to determine whether his happiness had been spontaneous or calculated, whether it reflected material attachment or spiritual gratitude, and whether it demonstrated proper humility about his role as a mere instrument of divine commercial will. The tribunal ultimately ruled that Klaus's genuine happiness about his business success proved he had lost sight of the spiritual purposes that should guide all commercial activity. They argued that properly spiritual merchants would feel anxiety rather than joy about material success, since such success created increased responsibility for charitable giving and spiritual stewardship. Klaus was sentenced to emotional reconstruction therapy, which involved daily sessions with church counselors who attempted to retrain his emotional responses to commercial activities. He was required to practice feeling appropriately anxious about business success and properly grateful for business failures, since failures provided opportunities for spiritual growth through adversity. The most comprehensive economic control system developed in the Italian banking cities, where authorities created what they called monetary virtue theory, a legal framework that regulated not just the lending and borrowing of money, but the spiritual implications of every financial transaction. The city of Siena became the center of these innovations, developing techniques that made normal banking operations virtually impossible without constant risk of prosecution. Master Lorenzo the banker learned the scope of these monetary virtue laws when he was charged with temporal usury, the crime of charging interest rates that failed to account for the spiritual time value of money. The prosecution argued that Lorenzo's conventional interest calculations ignored the fact that time belonged to God, and that any use of temporal progression for profit required additional spiritual compensation beyond normal financial interest. The theological experts called to testify in Lorenzo's case explained that conventional banking had failed to recognize the sacred nature of time itself. They argued that when money was lent across time, the lender was effectively renting divine temporal progression for material profit, which constituted a form of spiritual theft that required confession, penance, and additional payments to church authorities. Lorenzo was required to recalculate all his existing loans using spiritually adjusted interest rates that included charges for temporal usage, divine oversight fees, and spiritual risk assessments. The new calculations made most of his loans unprofitable and forced him to demand additional payments from borrowers who had already completed their original obligations. The most devastating aspect of these economic control systems was how they created cascading failures that destroyed entire commercial networks. When individual merchants like Eric, Klaus, and Lorenzo were forced to operate under impossible virtue requirements, their business failures created problems for everyone who traded with them. Suppliers lost reliable customers, buyers lost dependable sources, and entire trading routes collapsed as commercial virtue prosecutions spread throughout the merchant community. The authorities had successfully created economic systems where prosperity itself was evidence of spiritual corruption, where business success proved demonic influence, and where the natural human emotions associated with successful commerce became criminal offences. They had transformed the basic mechanisms of economic survival into elaborate tests of spiritual virtue that were designed to ensure failure for anyone without direct political protection. By the early 14th century, these economic virtue laws had created commercial environments where genuine trade was virtually impossible. Merchants spent more time documenting their spiritual compliance than conducting actual business. Markets became theatres where predetermined spiritual dramas were performed, rather than places where goods were efficiently exchanged. The economic foundations of medieval society were being systematically destroyed by legal systems that treated commercial success as inherently sinful and business failure as spiritually beneficial. While the economic virtue laws we've explored demonstrate how medieval authorities criminalize material survival, an even more insidious form of control was simultaneously perfecting itself across Europe, the systematic invasion and regulation of human consciousness itself. This wasn't merely about controlling what people said or did, it was about controlling what they thought, what they dreamed, what they remembered, and ultimately what they believed about the nature of reality itself. The Papal States during the pontificate of Boniface VIII became the testing ground for what church lawyers called cogitatio regulata, regulated thinking that attempted to bring the very processes of human consciousness under direct legal jurisdiction. The theoretical foundation for this system was developed by Cardinal Matteo d'Acqua Sparta, a Franciscan scholar who argued that since thoughts were the precursors to all human actions, preventing sinful thoughts was not just preferable to punishing sinful actions. It was a moral imperative that required the full power of ecclesiastical law. The first victim of this experimental thought control system was Brother Paolo the Questioner, a monk at the monastery of San Salvatore near Rome, whose crime was asking questions that demonstrated what prosecutors called intellectual presumption beyond station. Brother Paolo's offence wasn't heresy in any traditional sense. He had never questioned church doctrine or challenged established theology. His crime was more subtle and, according to church authorities, more dangerous. He had wondered about things that were considered beyond the proper scope of monastic curiosity. The charges against Brother Paolo began when he was overheard asking another monk why God had chosen to create fleas, given that these creatures seemed to serve no purpose other than causing irritation to God's supposedly favoured creation, humanity. This question, which might seem like innocent theological curiosity, was interpreted by the newly established Tribunal of Cognitive Compliance as evidence of dangerous intellectual independence that threatened the fundamental principle of unquestioning faith. The prosecution's case reveals the sophisticated theology that underpinned this new system of thought control. Expert witnesses testified that Brother Paolo's question about fleas demonstrated several forms of cognitive rebellion. First, the presumption that human reason could evaluate divine creation. Second, the implication that God's design might contain imperfections visible to human understanding. And third, the suggestion that creation should conform to human expectations of utility and purpose. But the tribunal's investigation went far beyond Brother Paolo's fleeting question about fleas. Church authorities had developed techniques for examining what they called cognitive patterns that might indicate systematic thought rebellion. Brother Paolo was subjected to weeks of intensive questioning designed to map his mental processes and identify dangerous thinking habits that might predict future intellectual crimes. The interrogators used methods that were remarkably sophisticated for their time, employing what amounted to early psychological analysis to probe Brother Paolo's mental state. They asked him to describe his dreams in detail, searching for evidence of nocturnal intellectual rebellion that might occur when conscious control was relaxed. They examined his prayer habits, looking for signs of mental wandering during prescribed devotions. They even analysed his handwriting for evidence of scriptorial distraction that might indicate insufficient mental focus on orthodox thoughts. Perhaps most insidiously, the tribunal developed a technique called cognitive provocation testing, where Brother Paolo was deliberately presented with theological puzzles and paradoxes while observers monitored his facial expressions and response patterns. The goal wasn't to test his theological knowledge, but to determine whether he possessed the dangerous tendency to seek rational solutions to divine mysteries that were meant to be accepted through faith alone. The results of these cognitive tests were presented as scientific evidence of Brother Paulo's mental corruption. The prosecution argued that his facial expressions during theological questioning revealed micro-expressions of doubt that proved his conscious statements of faith were contradicted by unconscious intellectual rebellion. They claimed that his tendency to pause before answering complex theological questions demonstrated hesitational heresy, the dangerous practice of subjecting divine truth to human evaluation before acceptance. Brother Paulo was ultimately sentenced to cognitive reconstruction therapy, a comprehensive program designed to eliminate dangerous thinking patterns and replace them with appropriate mental habits. The therapy involved daily sessions where he was required to practice reflexive acceptance of theological statements without any intervening thought process. He was trained to suppress questions immediately upon their formation, to redirect curious thoughts toward approved devotional topics, and to maintain what the tribunal called mental obedience at all times. But Brother Paulo's case was merely the beginning of a comprehensive expansion of thought control that would eventually encompass every aspect of intellectual life. The University of Paris, under pressure from papal authorities, established the Faculty of Cognitive Orthodoxy, an academic department specifically dedicated to identifying and correcting dangerous thought patterns among students and faculty. Master Guillaume, the logic teacher, discovered the reach of this new academic thought control when he was prosecuted for pedagogical presumption, after teaching students techniques for analysing logical arguments. The prosecution argued that Guillaume's logic lessons encouraged students to evaluate statements based on rational criteria, rather than accepting them through faithful obedience, creating a dangerous habit of intellectual independence that could eventually be applied to theological matters. The case against Guillaume reveals how academic thought control operated through the redefinition of education itself. Church authorities argued that true education should involve the transmission of approved knowledge rather than the development of analytical capabilities. They claimed that teaching students to think critically was actually a form of intellectual corruption that prepared them for future rebellion against divine authority. Guillaume's trial included detailed examination of his teaching methods, with former students called as witnesses to testify about the cognitive techniques they had learned in his classes. The prosecution presented evidence that students who had studied with Guillaume showed increased tendencies to ask questions, seek evidence for claims, and apply logical analysis to problems, behaviours that were reinterpreted as symptoms of spiritual contamination through exposure to unauthorised thinking methods. The tribunal ruled that Guillaume's teaching methods constituted intellectual seduction, a form of spiritual corruption that operated by making rational analysis seem more attractive than faithful acceptance. They argued that his logic lessons were essentially training students in the same mental rebellion that had caused Satan's fall from heaven, making Guillaume responsible for the spiritual corruption of an entire generation of students. Guillaume was sentenced to pedagogical reformation, which required him to continue teaching, but under methods designed to discourage rather than develop analytical thinking. His new curriculum focused on memorization of approved texts rather than analysis of logical relationships. Students were required to accept his statements without question and were penalized for asking for explanations or evidence. The most comprehensive application of thought control occurred through the establishment of confession inquisition, a system that transformed the traditional sacrament of confession into a comprehensive surveillance mechanism for monitoring the mental state of entire populations. Parish priests were retrained as cognitive investigators who used confession sessions to map the thought patterns of their congregations and identify individuals whose mental habits posed threats to spiritual order. Father Benedetto of Orvieto, whose detailed confession record survived in church archives, provides insight into how this system operated in practice. His notes show that by 1315, confession sessions had evolved into elaborate psychological examinations that could last for hours and covered every aspect of a person's mental life. Penitents were required to describe not just their actions, but their thoughts, dreams, fantasies, doubts, and emotional responses to religious experiences. Father Benedetto's techniques for examining mental states were remarkably sophisticated. He asked penitents to describe their thoughts during different types of weather, their emotional responses to various types of church music, and their mental imagery during prayer. He was particularly interested in identifying what he called cognitive irregularities, thought patterns that deviated from approved mental habits, even when they didn't constitute obvious sins. The information gathered through these enhanced confession sessions was systematically recorded and analysed for patterns that might indicate community-wide threats to cognitive orthodoxy. Father Benedetto's records show extensive cross-referencing between different penitents' mental states, allowing church authorities to map the intellectual climate of entire parishes and identify emerging trends in dangerous thinking before they could manifest in heretical actions. Perhaps most devastatingly, the Confession Inquisition system created a feedback loop where the very act of monitoring thoughts made those thoughts more dangerous. Penitents who attempted to hide their mental irregularities were guilty of confessional deception, while those who revealed their unauthorized thoughts were guilty of cognitive rebellion. The system ensured that anyone with an active mental life would eventually be prosecuted for thought crimes, regardless of their actual beliefs or behaviors. By 1320, these thought control systems had created populations that were afraid to think, afraid to dream, and afraid to wonder about anything beyond the narrow range of approved mental activities. The intellectual curiosity that had driven the great theological and philosophical developments of the earlier medieval period had been systematically criminalized, replaced by mental habits that prioritized obedience over understanding and conformity over creativity. As we reach the end of this dark journey through the labyrinth of medieval legal horror, we find ourselves confronting a truth that is both deeply disturbing and strangely familiar. The systems we've explored, from Alric's reed-cutting catastrophe to Brother Paolo's criminalized curiosity, weren't the products of primitive minds stumbling through an ignorant age. They were the creations of some of the most sophisticated legal and theological thinkers in human history, people who understood exactly what they were building and why it was necessary for maintaining their vision of perfect order. What we've witnessed is nothing less than the most comprehensive attempt at human control ever devised, a legal framework so thorough that it regulated not just actions and words, but thoughts, dreams, emotions, and the very biological processes of existence itself. Medieval law didn't just punish criminals, it created a world where being human was inherently criminal, where every natural impulse and every spark of curiosity became evidence of spiritual corruption that required correction, containment, or elimination. The genius of this system lay not in its cruelty, which was merely a byproduct, but in its psychological sophistication. By creating impossible standards and then offering the illusion of mercy through selective enforcement, medieval authorities ensured that every person lived in a state of perpetual gratitude for not being destroyed. The peasant who escaped prosecution for gathering forbidden reeds felt thankful rather than angry. The merchant who survived commercial virtue investigations felt blessed rather than oppressed. The scholar who avoided thought crime charges felt fortunate rather than constrained. This psychological manipulation was so effective that it outlasted the specific legal systems that created it. Even when medieval law codes were eventually reformed or replaced, the mental habits they had instilled, the reflexive self-doubt, the fear of standing out, the assumption that authority must have good reasons for its demands, persisted for centuries. The true legacy of medieval law wasn't written in legal codes or court records, but in the collective unconscious of populations that had been systematically trained to police themselves. Yet even within this seemingly omnipotent system of control, human resistance never entirely disappeared. In monastery scriptoriums, monks like Brother Anselm continued to prioritize human life over regulatory compliance, accepting punishment as the price of maintaining their humanity. In trading centres, merchants like Eric the Amber Trader found ways to preserve quality craftsmanship despite legal systems designed to eliminate excellence. In universities, teachers like Master Guillaume continued to encourage critical thinking even when such encouragement had been redefined as spiritual corruption. These acts of resistance weren't always dramatic or heroic. More often, they were quiet, subtle, and almost invisible. A moment of genuine human connection that violated social distance requirements. A question asked despite the risk of intellectual presumption charges, the act of kindness performed despite laws designed to make kindness suspicious. The resistance existed not in grand rebellions that challenged the system directly, but in millions of small decisions to remain human despite legal frameworks designed to eliminate humanity. Perhaps most remarkably, we can trace direct connections between these medieval legal innovations and systems of control that have emerged in more recent times. The techniques for turning protective laws into persecution mechanisms, the methods for criminalizing entire populations through bureaucratic procedures, the psychological strategies for making people grateful for their own oppression, All of these have reappeared throughout history in forms that would be immediately recognizable to the legal architects of medieval Europe. When we see modern surveillance systems that monitor not just actions but emotional states, we're witnessing the technological implementation of principles first developed by Father Benedetto's Confession Inquisition. When we encounter bureaucratic procedures that make compliance technically possible but practically impossible, we're experiencing refined versions of the Catch-22 systems that destroyed Master Godwin the Illuminator. When we observe legal frameworks that can transform any citizen into a criminal through selective interpretation of vague regulations, we're seeing the descendants of the laws that eliminated the Valdensian communities. The medieval legal architects understood something that modern authoritarians have rediscovered. The most effective forms of control are those that make resistance not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable. By regulating consciousness itself, by criminalizing the mental processes that might lead to questioning authority, by creating populations that were afraid to wonder, dream, or imagine alternatives to their circumstances, medieval law achieved a form of control that was more complete than any physical coercion could accomplish. But the very comprehensiveness of these systems also contained the seeds of their eventual collapse. Legal frameworks that attempted to regulate every aspect of human existence required enormous administrative apparatus that eventually became too expensive and too complex to maintain. The psychological pressure of living under impossible standards eventually created populations that were too paralyzed by fear to function productively. The systematic elimination of intellectual curiosity and creative thinking ultimately produced societies that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances or solve emerging problems. By the 14th century, the Black Death exposed the fundamental weakness of societies that had criminalized the very qualities, curiosity, adaptability, independent thinking, that were necessary for survival in crisis conditions. Legal systems that had spent centuries eliminating human initiative found themselves helpless when faced with challenges that required exactly the kinds of innovative responses they had systematically suppressed. The collapse of medieval legal control wasn't sudden or complete, but it was inevitable. Systems that had been designed to eliminate human unpredictability discovered that unpredictability was actually essential for human survival. Societies that had created legal frameworks to prevent change found themselves unable to change when change became necessary. The very perfection of medieval control mechanisms became their ultimate weakness. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll find some comfort in this historical lesson about the resilience of human nature and the ultimate futility of systems that attempt to control it completely. The medieval world created legal frameworks that seemed impossibly sophisticated and comprehensively oppressive, yet they still couldn't eliminate the fundamental human capacities for kindness, curiosity, creativity, and connection that made life worth living even under the worst circumstances. The people we've met tonight, Alric cutting reeds for his family's survival, Willem pursuing his passion for metalworking, Margarita trying to use her literacy to help her community, Antonio becoming absorbed in creating beautiful glass, Lucia dancing with unconscious grace. All of them faced legal systems designed to crush the very qualities that made them most human. Yet they persisted in being human anyway, accepting the consequences but refusing to surrender the essential parts of themselves that no law could legitimately claim to control. Their stories remind us that human dignity isn't something that can be granted or revoked by legal systems, no matter how sophisticated those systems become. It's something that exists independently of authority, something that survives even the most comprehensive attempts at control, something that continues to manifest itself in small acts of courage, kindness, and creativity that can never be entirely suppressed. The worst medieval laws you couldn't escape ultimately failed, not because they weren't clever enough or comprehensive enough, but because they misunderstood the fundamental nature of what they were trying to control. Human consciousness, human creativity, human connection. These aren't problems to be solved or threats to be eliminated. They're the essential qualities that make life meaningful, and they have a stubborn tendency to reassert themselves no matter how many laws are written to prevent them. The greatest victory over medieval law wasn't won in courtrooms or battlefields, but in the simple persistence of people who refused to stop being human despite every legal incentive to surrender their humanity. That victory continues today, in every moment when we choose curiosity over compliance, connection over isolation, and hope over fear. Sweet dreams, and remember, no system of control, however sophisticated, has ever succeeded in eliminating the fundamental human capacity for resilience, resistance, and renewal that keeps the best parts of our nature alive through even the darkest chapters of history. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.